Extreme measures. Dada and the post-war avant-garde. Dada was born of a revolt that was shared by all adolescents. Tristan Zara beauty must be convulsive or not at all. André Breton. The sudden collapse of European political equilibrium into the horrors of World War I caught the French boho scene unawares. Some joined the war effort, while others protested in the spirit of anarchism, or pacifism, or simple humaneness. The war was a slaughter unlike any witnessed by humanity up to that point. More than 8 million people were killed. With no clear aggressor, the conflagration was sort of like a barroom brawl writ large. The democracies of Europe and the United States tried to sell it as a war to save civilization. The sentiment that spread through the boho community in Paris was precisely opposite. Many writers and artists viewed the war as proof that civilization had failed, and that the sweet reason posited by the Enlightenment had only served to muzzle expressions of the subconscious, conveniently discovered by Freud half a decade earlier, which had finally erupted with a volcanic fury. Disciplined, uniformed psychos marching in long, straight rows under orders to kill and be killed had unleashed more unholy chaos than the disorderly artists of Paris could have ever imagined, or, certainly, wished for. If logic, discipline, and bourgeois refinement produced this bloody insanity, then the only way out was irrationality, disobedience, and provocation. Enter Dada. Dadaism, a deliberate nonsense term, was the opening shout of an anti-art movement that aimed to make all-out war on cultural formality and constraint. In his first Dadaist manifesto, the poet Tristan Tzara wrote, "Dada is our intensity. It erects bayonets without consequence. Dada is art without slippers or parallel. We know in our wisdom that our heads will become soft cushions. It's still shit, but we now want to shit in many colors, to decorate the zoological garden of art with all the flags of the consulates, du bong hibo aho, hiho aho." The Dadaists got their start in, of all places, Zurich, Switzerland, at an avant-garde art club called Cabaret Voltaire toward the end of the war. Artists would gather to read poetry and speak nonsense, to bang out rhythms, shout, howl, and indulge in random, formless song and dance. This cacophony, they felt, was the only artistic statement that remained possible amidst the war. Tzara wrote, "The new artist protests. He doesn't paint anymore." One day, Cabaret Voltaire organizer Hugo Ball announced that he was starting a small magazine called Dada. Tristan Tzara was struck by the word and began constructing nonsense poetics in its name. Dadaism was born. While the Dadaists were ready to flush art history in its entirety down the toilet, they did acknowledge one great inspiration from the recent past, Alfred Jarry. Jarry may still qualify as the most eccentric artist the world has ever known. He first gained notice in Paris in 1896 when a play he wrote opened with an actor crying, "Merd," a Jarry-esque mutation of the word merd, meaning shit. The shocked late 19th century audience rose to its feet as one in horror. Clearly, they were ill-prepared for the 20th century. Jarry was a prankster and practical joker who was always firing off his beloved gun in public, albeit not at persons. His greatest and most famous prank was his staging of that play, Ubu Roy. The play centered around a thoroughly revolting, gluttonous, obscenity-spewing, and spontaneously murderous character who, at the same time, displays all the pomposity and self-righteousness of a man of political or economic power. While the opening performance in 1896 caused a riot, the play was well received by many elements of the European intelligentsia. Reviewers compared Jarry to Shakespeare and Rabelais. The respected literary journal Verse Prose called the play one of the masterpieces of French genius. But Ubu Roi was not written by Jarry. It was a joke, written collectively a few years previous by a small group of 16-year-old students, Jarry among them. He was, in fact, only a minor contributor. They were making fun of their physics professor, who, as fate would have it, eventually became a reactionary political figure. The students' parody of their pompous and authoritarian teacher was praised by leading intellectuals, who credited Jarry for what they took to be a corusque of figures like Robespierre and Napoleon. Jarry's confusing of authorship was an intentional prank, not merely an act of exploitation. Jarry himself allowed for ambiguity when questioned about it, and his fellow ex-students enjoyed the joke well enough to play along. The Ubu Roy character was pure-eyed, and Jarry became obsessed with the freeing potentials of his antisocial behaviors. Frank. He strode about on the stage of his life as a copy of this character. He scandalized the habitues of fashionable drawing rooms with his provocation, his insolence, and with conduct which brandished the banner of libertarianism and anarchism, rejecting the plush chairs of official academies. André Breton, soon to become the dominant force in surrealism, son of Dada, said, starting with Jerry, much more than Wilde, the distinction long deemed necessary between art and life was blurred until it was finally abolished. As with many authentic pranks, the prankster's ego took perhaps the hardest hit. Jerry's lifelong acting out of the Ubu Roy persona had both the character of liberation and of resignation. He would often complain that this casual joke of a cabal of high school wags was by far his most popular work. Even his brilliant invention of an imaginary science he named pataphysics, a methodology for examining reality using paradoxes and anomalies as points of departure, never quite received the acclaim Ubu Roy did, although pataphysical was later name-dropped in Paul McCartney's Beatles song Maxwell's Silver Hammer. Soon after the Great War, Tristan Tzara migrated to Paris, where he joined forces with a band of poetic insurgents including Louis Aragon, Philippe Soupault, and the forcefully charismatic André Breton. Tzara had written that Dada was born of a need for independence, a distrust of the community, and Frank asserts that the Dadaists' project meant no more groups, no more theories, down with the Cubists and the Futurists. They were nothing but laboratories of formalist ideas. Of course, the Dadaists were a group. No problem. Tzara had nothing but contempt for anyone seeking explanation. Dada poet Francis Picabia wrote, Dada itself feels nothing. It is nothing, nothing, nothing. It is like your hopes, nothing. Like your heavens, nothing. Like your gods, nothing. Like your politicians, nothing. Like your heroes, nothing. Like your artists, nothing. Aspects of Dadaism suggest a sort of angry European version of radical Taoism. The Taoists gently teased the grasping, categorizing, limiting, logical mind with jokes, riddles, and meditative exercises. The Dadaists impatiently threw cultural Molotov cocktails over the psychic barricades at the anal retentive Europeans. The Dadaists' weapons in this war against civilized thought were nihilistic poetry, pranks, absurd theatrical events, name-calling, and most of all, assaultive invasions of Parisian artistic events that were deemed just a bit too stuffy and self-important. Picasso, for one, was denounced as an old soldier who had died upon the field of honor. In other words, once radical, but now sterile. He would later become friends with the Surrealists. A typical Dada event is described by Frank. On the 26th of May 1920, the Dada Festival was held in the Salle Gaveau. All the Dadaists would have their hair shaved in public. The show would not only be on the stage, thanks to MM, Aragon, Breton, Eluard, Frankel, Soupault, and Tzara, but also in the audience, which would, it was hoped, be large and quarrelsome. Tzara opened the show by exhibiting Le Sexe de Dada, an enormous wooden phallus balanced on some balloons. Then the famous illusionist Philippe Soupault appeared, made up to look like a black man, wearing a dressing gown and armed with a cutlass. He freed 5 balloons on which were written the identities of those who were flying high, balloons which had to be burst: a pope, a man of war, a statesman, a woman of letters, and F8 poet Cocteau, the first to die, pierced by the blade of the surrealist poet. In the audience there was pandemonium. Unless one is seeking a sort of Taoist illumination, overthrowing all that is tight-assed in Western civilization, or succeeds in anti-art by its nature, can only carry you so far. After a few provocations, what was there really to do? Many decades later, Marcel Duchamp would solve this conundrum by abandoning art to dedicate his life to chess. In 1922, grasping these limitations, the ambitious Breton pronounced Dada dead and announced the advent of surrealism. A personality clash with Tzara supplied added motivation. Surrealism, the term had been casually invented by Apollinaire a few years earlier to describe a theatrical presentation, was basically Dadaism plus. Breton's redirection was to proclaim a purpose, give art a reason to go on. According to surrealism, the artist's job was to give expression to the unexpurgated, uncensored unconscious. Breton's pronunciamento would cast a long shadow. Hundreds, maybe, ranging from Man Ray to Salvador thousands, of reputable artists and writers Dali, to the poet Garcia Lorca, to the popular English comedy troupe Monty Python's Flying Circus. would get to hawk their wares under the sign of surrealism through the remainder of the 20th century. Surrealism would eventually become just another genre in the 20th century's media spectacle, irreverent but hardly revolutionary. But in the Parisian 1920s, the Surrealists were still carrying forward all the elements of the Dada insurrection, and now they were organized thanks to André Breton's nasty authoritarian tendencies. Salvador Dali would later write that Breton was as rigid as St. Andrew's cross. Breton's imagination had been fired up by Lenin's successful Bolshevik Revolution. Wishing to get in on the fun in his own antic way, he started sponsoring trials and eventually purges against other participants in the Surrealist movement. Initially, the trials, over which Breton would rule, had an appropriately playful Alice through the looking glass quality. They were nonsensical and ludicrous, comprehensible only as a sort of parody of Communist Party discipline. But underneath the delirium, Breton meant it, and eventually the Pope of Surrealism's excommunicational activities would become hurtful. Still, we must credit this alpha leader from Deliria for having the skills necessary to rally the Surrealists to continue the program of Dada disturbance throughout the 1920s. Most of his Surrealist compatriots, such as Man Ray and Max Ernst, would likely have been content to hang out, as they frequently did, sniffing cocaine and making word and image collages. But when Breton called his minions to battle, they showed up, out of respect, no doubt, but also out of a desire to avoid a Bretonian hissy fit, if not surreal excommunication. Perhaps this relationship is illustrative of a prime countercultural irony. However anarchic and hang loose the philosophy may be, there has to be at least one poor, anxious bastard prodding things along, or the cultural movement dissipates into historical irrelevance, which might also be okay from a certain countercultural perspective. But then what would I be writing about? One of the most famous Surrealist provocations seems to have been spontaneous and situational. In July 1925, the Surrealists were invited to attend a formal banquet sponsored by Les Nouvelles Littéraires for all its contributors. While many Surrealists wrote for it, this was a mainstream literary journal that featured many of France's most distinguished men of letters. The Surrealists were well behaved as the dinner party proceeded, until the conservative Madame Rothschild was overheard saying, "A French woman should never marry a German." Appalled at this xenophobia, Breton rose to his feet and told the woman, "What you have said is extremely insulting to our friend Max Ernst." As Frank tells it, an apple flew through the air, then another. Breton threw a napkin in Rothschild's face, crying, "Soldiers, whore!" The battle was on. On every side, food flew. The platter of fish and cream sauce was a catapult, and everything served as ammunition. The fresh vegetables, the silverware, the wine, the glasses, the plates. Philippe Soupeau took a deep breath, grabbed onto the chandelier, hung there and swung from it, kicking out at everyone who passed. Rushing in from a neighboring room, Louis de Gonzague Frick threw himself in turn on the Surrealists. André Breton pushed open a window, shattering it. A crowd had gathered on the pavement. Max Ernst Cup and shouted, "Down with Germany!" Michel Leiris answered, "Down with France!" "Long live China," someone shouted. "Long live the Africans," cried someone else. According to Frank, this was a great scandal. The next day, the whole of the press lashed out at the Surrealists, accusing them of being the terrors of the Boulevard Montparnasse. The Society of Men of Letters and the Writers' Association of Former Combatants, in conjunction with l'Action Française, requested the names of these men never be mentioned again, so as to cut them off from public view for good. Nothing of the sort would occur. Surrealist outrages sold newspapers. As disturbing as Breton's power-tripping might seem, he was still too much of an anarchist at heart to ever realize his dreams of unifying Surrealism with the International Communist Party. When a party comrade asked him when the Surrealists were going to be ready for the real revolution, Breton shot back that the Communist Party didn't have a monopoly on revolution, and that his subjective transformation was just as essential as their political revolution. No discussion of Surrealism would be complete without mention of Antonin Artaud. Artaud fell into the Surrealist circle during its early years. A French poet, dramatist, actor, and student of magic and the occult, Artaud would become perhaps the 20th century's most unabashed apologist for opium, and he would write lyrically about his peyote experience. He asserted that his hours spent high on peyote were the only time he ever felt at home in this world. Breton excommunicated him from surrealism in the mid 1920s for his mystical tendencies. But Artaud's most creative period was ahead of him. Influenced by Oriental theater, he developed the theater of cruelty, the first art theory that explicitly attempted to break the proscenium between actor and audience. Artaud wrote that his theater would also break through language in order to touch life. He envisioned in theater the release of such magical potency that the participants' bodies themselves would be transformed and their immortal nature unveiled. According to actor Jean-Louis Barrault, Artaud oozed magical desires. He was the metaphysician of the theater. Insisting on the literally magical transformative power of art, he deeply explored the metaphysics underlying his work. And like Jarry's, his disregard for social convention was total. In the 1930s, Artaud's work began to show an obsession with his own sensed persecution, and he spent 10 years, 1937 to 1946, in a French mental institution. Not a bad choice, actually, considering that he got to sit out World War II. A program of 51 electroshock treatments could not change Artaud's view that society sucked. After his release in 1946, he wrote his most furious yet cogent and transcendent essays, including Van Gogh, The Suicide of Society, and performed a radio broadcast titled To Have Done with the Judgment of God. He died of cancer in 1948.